Hi. In this video, I want to summarize William James Jennings' book called The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. And that book was really helpful for me in thinking through some of the issues that you'll come across in Terry Donaldson's approach as well. We're thinking about ethnicities and race and the ways that they have been used and misused in the history of Christianity, and also thinking about new ways to imagine the relationship within Christianity between different races. So this is my summary of Willie James Jennings' book, The Christian Imagination. So he starts by talking about the way supersessionism, which is the doctrine that replaces Israel with Christians as the people of God. And he says that doing that created a hole in the theological imagination that Europeans were able to fill with themselves. And so if you think about that, we have the Old and the New Testament. We have the people of God in the Old Testament that are clearly chosen. And if what we do with Christianity is we construct a theology in which Christians replace the Israelites as the people of God, then the Israelites basically disappear from the story. And as Europeans made that move, then Europeans constructed themselves into that space. Now, moving on from there, then, creation and the incarnation demonstrate God and Christ's focus on the whole world, which Europeans then constructed themselves as the regions of, with authority to construct whiteness as closer to God and blackness as farther away. Think about what I just said about this idea that Christians have replaced Jews as the people of God. And if all the Christians we know are white, then there's a connection there where it ends up being white people who replace Jews as the people of God. And then Europeans were able to say, oh, we are the people of God. We get to decide what the people of God should look like in our particular instance of that. And what we see is that white people are mostly Christians, and anybody with darker skin is mostly not Christian. So it's easy for us to decide that that is the way it is, that white people are somehow naturally closer to God, and Black people are naturally farther away. I'm mimicking here, just to be clear, what the ways that Europeans have thought in the past, and some do still think today. Now this move detaches people from place, time, and culture, and sets them instead within an abstract theological frame imagined to be Christianity. Now let me just take a little sidetrack here. It is when we say Christianity, and particularly, and now I'm going to include myself, when we as white Western Christians think of Christianity, and we sometimes talk as though Christianity was a universal religion, and we talk about it in very abstract terms, we are often very unaware of how much this imagined Christianity that we imagine to be neutral is actually very rooted and grounded in our own culture, especially in America, where we have this very large country and a lot of Americans never leave our country. There's sometimes a difficulty imagining other ways of living, other cultures, basically. And so our own culture becomes invisible to us. And so we think that the Christianity that we live is the normal Christianity, the neutral Christianity, because again, we're just very unaware of the particularity of the kind of Christianity that we inhabit. And that certainly is something that exists today, but it's also grounded in this move that Europeans made in the past of replacing themselves as the people of God and then thinking of themselves as the stewards, the regents of what Christianity would look like among the people of God. Now, back to Willie James Jennings. By creating identities based on race rather than geography, white colonials with godlike hubris lost their own and removed others' connection to the land, connections that grounded many people's knowledge of who they were and how they acted. This cannot be solved by simply erasing race because there's nothing left to ground identity except bare individualism. As Europeans began the conquests during the age of conquering, they stopped seeing themselves as grounded specifically in Europe and started seeing themselves as inhabitants of the world. And then when they encountered other peoples whose identity was closely rooted in a particular geographical space, this was not something Europeans comprehended, and so they didn't have any trouble erasing it. They felt that they could appropriate for themselves land that looked to them like it didn't belong to anybody, but that in fact grounded the identities of these other groups of people that they were encountering. That means that we can't now go backwards and say race isn't anything, these racial ideas that Europeans constructed, because if we do that, there's nothing left for different people groups around the world in which to ground our identities. Now, upon coming to these new peoples in new worlds, again back to Jennings, Christians could have used the tools they had used to Christianize Aristotle, or the memories of themselves as Gentiles who had had to be Christianized, to imagine these new people as neighbors to be loved, as people among whom God was already at work, and with whom they could imagine new ways of faithfulness to God, both for them and for themselves. So think about that. You may or may not be aware that when Christians studied Aristotle, there was this desire, even though Aristotle lived long before Jesus, to say, oh, but we really like Aristotle. And actually, we can see in Aristotle hints of Christianity. And so we are going to talk about Aristotle as though he's kind of a Christian, even though clearly he wasn't. That could have been something they used. That tool that was used to Christianize Aristotle could have been something they used to open their eyes to the ways that God was already at work in the people groups that they encountered. Or they could have thought of themselves, instead of thinking of themselves as replacements for the people of God, they could have recognized that the Jewish people are still the people of God, and that Gentiles are part of the people of God because we have been invited to the table. And that would have allowed Europeans to sit down with these new groups of people they were encountering and imagine together what life might look like, assuming that these other groups were also people who were invited to the table, just like Europeans had been, and that they were people among whom God was already at work. Instead, because Europeans saw themselves as the new Israel and believed that they were able to categorize everybody else as pagans, and because they imagined the new people abstracted from their land, we talked about that, and therefore were unable to comprehend them as people, they turned theology and pedagogy inside out. And so instead of coming to these people as Christ came to the world, teaching from a position of humility, they put pedagogy first before theology, and they constructed themselves as the teachers and the regulators and the evaluators par excellence of the whole world. They even saw the riches that they found in these new worlds they were discovering as God's reward and even enticement for their hard labor in converting people whom they judged to be inferior and demon taught. And they imagined that their own difficulties in converting these new people as their own version of the sufferings of the apostle. I found that particular chapter really powerful to help me as a European see what my history is like and the ways that Europeans constructed a theology that allowed them to become colonizers and oppressors in the world. Western Christianity, then, unmoored from the story of Israel, is seen as neutral and therefore able to be translated into every and any other culture. But this act of translation, undertaken by colonials for colonial interests, translates Black bodies and interest only from and for the perspective of white ones. So the goal became the taming and the use of the other. And Christianity had to be used to serve those interests because those interests became invisible to the colonist behind Christianity. Again, there's this perception that the Christianity that Westerners inhabit is a neutral Christianity. And so the colonial interests that are often come in as a package with Western Christianity can be made to be invisible behind what we are calling Christianity. What is missing is both the particularity of God's choice of self-revelation through Israel and white and Black communion as fellow strangers and dependence on a Savior who comes to them, to all of us, from a world of particularities different from our own. So Christ came in a particular culture, in a particular form, which values rather than devalues the particularities that each one of us inhabit. So, to sum up, it's not about some non existent neutral Christianity that can be translated into each and every culture, which can only ultimately serve nationalist goals that end up dividing people. It's about all cultures other than Israel being invited to be guests together at a table that is fundamentally Israelite. Now, some African economies in the past, and maybe still today, but certainly in the past, tied commercial exchanges to relationships. How are you going to make a treaty? How are you going to make a deal, a business deal together, except on the basis of a history of relationships between your two families? But Western economy was not like that. And so by transforming Africans into Blacks and slaves, that cut them off from all their previous economic relationships, but it also prevented them from having any new relationships based on economic exchanges with white people because white people didn't see them as equal and didn't use relationships as a basis for commercial exchanges. Even salvation was not imagined in a way that could change that. So, salvation for Black people in the 18th century constituted them in a relationship with God and with the scriptures, but it was a salvation into a Christianity that was impoverished by its inability to address the social and economic injustices of its world because it couldn't overcome the racial and economic constructions of the West. In fact, those racial and economic constructions were smuggled in under the guise of Christianity. Now, again, I'm summarizing Willie James Jennings' work. He was particularly interested in the history of slavery and Black people in America, but I imagine that you will see resonances and applications for you and the history of India with colonial powers. In translating the Bible into each language Europeans encountered, they created literary spaces that were separate and distinct, fracturing the world. At the same time, as elite discussions moved from Latin into European vernaculars, first French and then later Latin, they vied for primacy as the one impartial space for world-shaping discussions. This can be seen in a powerful example in the way in which American slaves were denied literacy and thus prevented from speaking into white spaces. In this way, Western whiteness constructed the world in capitalistic ways in which Black and brown bodies were primarily valued and evaluated according to their utility to whites. Still today, worldwide commerce and entertainment are primarily structured by and for standards of European whiteness, even if they are occasionally embodied by people of color. So there's two things I want to highlight here. First of all, it's this idea of languages, which I have always imagined as being an empowering thing, that we would translate the scriptures into somebody's original mother tongue so that they could encounter the scriptures from that space. But I hadn't thought about the way creating and valuing this separate space in which people can keep their own cultures and speak their own languages also separates them from the worldwide conversations that are mostly white, mostly first French and then Latin and now English. And so I think this has implications still today for the ways in which what we call in the West scholarship exists primarily in English with occasionally a few other European languages thrown in, but that generally brackets out anything that we don't easily have access to in at least a European language. And so that too is an act of colonialism. Now, the second thing I wanted to mention is that these structures, these frameworks are not only inhabited by white people anymore because of colonialism, because of the predominance of white people in the West and the power that we have held. This structuring of Christianity has been exported around the world, and to the extent that it has been adopted by people who don't look like us, it can also be inhabited and perpetuated by people of any race, any color, any culture, depending on how aware they are of the colonial implications of some of this material. So, what's the way forward? Well, this is what Willie James Jennings suggests. He says we must first remember that we are Gentiles. We were eavesdroppers on this conversation between God and Israel before we were brought in. God broke into a pagan Gentile world to create Israel. Think about Abraham and Abraham's call. And then he broke into Israelite existence through Jesus to eventually, by the Spirit, invite Gentiles in. But God does not offer any of us self-sufficiency, security, or domination. Instead, God offers himself in Jesus. So Jesus's body becomes the place where we meet as we express communion with God, and flowing from that, our desire for communion with one another. We are reconstituted then as brothers and sisters in a way that must cause us to reimagine the colonial outlook that uses another's land for my own enrichment. The divisions and hierarchies of the capitalist system are thus questioned and resisted in this new space, in which the suffering of the Jew and the suffering of the marginalized, and for Willie James Jennings specifically, African Americans, but any marginalized people more broadly, have something to say to each other. The suffering of the Jew and the suffering of any marginalized people have something to say to each other. The misshapenness of white colonial theology needs to learn the language of the other in order to be broken and recreated in the image of God. So I wanted to introduce you to this work, this book called, again, it's called The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race by Willie James Jennings. It's a difficult book. It's not a quick read, but it's excellent. And if you want to learn more about any of the things I've just described, that's where you would go. Thanks for listening.